Well, good morning, everybody. The purpose of this video is to take a look at the late 19th century in time period 6 and look at the topic of westward expansion, topic 6.2 and 6.3. A couple different areas of focus in here, looking at causes and effects, but the causes, we're going to look at some of the broad economic, social, and cultural causes for westward expansion of this time period. And then on the effects, we're going to look at some of the broader effects so far as what's going to happen with the competition for resources on the Western plains, as well as some of the conflicts that will ensue as a result of that competition. As you might imagine, this level of westward expansion is going to be heralded as a great thing for the United States. It is seen as the fulfillment of manifest destiny, that idea that we are God's chosen people and we have been destined by God to govern over this entire continent of land and to do it as a way that we can become a city upon a hill for the rest of the world to kind of see the right way to run a nation. The process of this happening, at least for this part of the country, in the Great Plains and all the way to the West Coast, this does have origins during going back into the middle of the Civil War. So we talked a little bit about this during the fall semester in time period 5 in the 1860s, but two significant pieces of legislation that come out during the Civil War. One is the 1862 Homestead Act. This is going to give away 160 acres of land for free to any family that is willing to improve the land over a 5-year stretch. Improve the land basically means you are going to go and establish a homestead, you are going to live there, and you are going to start, a small farm. This is going to encourage people to move out to the plains and establish these small farms. And as we'll see a little bit later on in this topic and beyond, there's some interesting consequences that come out of that. But here we're looking at causes, and this is definitely going to encourage people to begin to move out to the West. Probably an even bigger inspiration, influence, I guess, when you're talking about people moving to the West is going to be congressional passage of the Pacific Railway Act. This is passed during the Civil War, so this is 1862, before the Emancipation Proclamation. Congress passes a law that is going to provide funding to build a transcontinental railroad. That transcontinental railroad is going to do even more than the Homestead Act in terms of encouraging people to move out there, because as the railroads are being built, that connection link is going to encourage more people to take the risk to go out there, because they're not going to be quite as isolated as they were before, as they would have without the railroad, I mean to say. So what this means is, in context, what we've already seen in this unit, is that this is an example of where you're going to see some transportation and communication subsidizing. The federal government is going to give railroads a strip of land to build the railroad on and to be able to sell that land. Part of the reason they do this is that there's a government desire to encourage settlement to go out there and kind of more firmly establish that connection to the West. The other reason that they do this is because, it's cheaper to pay them directly in land in some cases than it is to give them more and more money during the war, when there's a lot of economic resources being spent towards the war effort. Ultimately, this is going to lead to the development of the Transcontinental Railroad. We have talked about this very much in passing when we looked at topic 6.6. Look, there's Cornelius Vanderbilt down there. In that conversation, we were really focused on the eastern part of the railroad network, but this is much more so focused on the western part. When it comes down to the first transcontinental line, the two railroad companies that are embarking on this construction effort, they are the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroad. The Union Pacific Railroad is going to do their construction starting of the Union Pacific is basically this blue line. So if I kind of laser point on this, the Union Pacific Railroad kind of starts here, like right at the Iowa-Nebraska state line. There's already a network of railroads connecting Iowa back over here to Chicago, which is connected to points back east. But the Union Pacific is going to build this rail line across the Great Plains. They call them the Union Pacific because they are trying to extend the Union. This is kind of where the thought is on the naming on this. The Central Pacific is the red line out here. I know you can see that in the legend down here at the bottom. The Central Pacific is called the Central Pacific because they are moving towards the center of the country. It's kind of a good branding sort of thing. Leader of the I guess the corporate head, the owner of the Central Pacific Rail Company, is this guy named Leland Stanford. And if that name Stanford is triggering for you for Stanford University, that's because that's his school. Just like Vanderbilt and Duke in North Carolina, these are all colleges that are named after some of these big business owners. The Construction starts in 1862, and finally, construction is going to be completed at Promontory Point, Utah, which is right there where I've got like where the two lines come together, just to the north of the Great Salt Lake City these days. And when this was completed in 1860, there was a lot of fanfare going along with it. This is the commemorative photo that was printed on postcards and circulated all over the country when they drove the last spike to connect the two rails together. The spike was a golden spike, and when they did this, they had it wired up with a telegraph line so they could understand nationwide exactly the moment that the economic network, linking two sides of the country was finally completed. And when this was done, it's not like things changed overnight, but it's also not like this is the only transcontinental rail network that's going to go. Between 1870 and 1890, there are 4 other railroad lines that are going to connect everything coast to coast. They're going to start branching off of those main lines. This is all about trying to create that national network, economic network that we've talked about in class. It's going to make the big businesses even bigger, and it's going to, well, inspire a whole litany of changes all over the country. On these rail lines, connecting things to other topics that we'll see. Topics 6.7 and 6.8 are about the influx of immigration to the United States. Well, rail workers were by and large immigrants. The Union Pacific rail workers were majority of them were Irish immigrants coming into the country because of anti-Irish and anti-Catholic prejudices that existed in eastern cities. Irish immigrants sometimes couldn't find work that was going to be in cities, and so they took these jobs that were kind of risky and dangerous out on the frontier because of conflict with Native Americans. And so this is going to be a prominent labor source for the Union Pacific. The Central Pacific and China are going to make broad use of Chinese immigrant laborers, which is going to increase the cultural diversity in California. And we'll see more examples of this in a couple of subsequent topics as well. The other thing that's going to come out as an effect of the Transcontinental Railroad is going to be the cheap land that's available for farmers. This cheap land for farmers is going to encourage, beyond the Homestead Act, you can go out there and get your 160 acres for free and maybe tack on a couple hundred extra acres dirt cheap if you could buy it from the rail companies. And so this is going to encourage more Western settlement. And I know I'm saying this is an effect of the Transcontinental Railroad, but all of this is a cause for this westward expansion. The Transcontinental Railroad is going to make an economic reason to want to expand to the western parts of the continent. Socially and culturally, there are other causes that are coming in as well. This is all very much going to make the United States a bigger, more connected nation. There are, of course, other causes to keep track of on this, but for this discussion, we're going to transition and look at some of the effects. And the real effects here is going to come down to the competition for the land itself and the resources that are on that land. The competition is really kind of building because of the increase of the migrant population that's moving out there. United States citizens that are moving into the Great Plains and into like the Western territories all the way out to California. One of the real effects that are going to come into this are going to be the impact on the American bison or the buffalo population in the United States. The bison population is going to be decimated, which is going to have like a lot of impact for American Indians because this was a resource that they used in great to a great extent to be able to survive and prosper on the Great Plains. Not a whole lot of other resources out there on the Great Plains in Kansas and Nebraska and the Dakotas, but the buffalo was a real piece of this. This is maybe the most valuable resource of anything that's out there. The competition for the land and for those resources really are coming from like different groups. As white settlers are moving out there, U.S. citizens that are moving out there, they are moving out there for economic reasons and for social cultural reasons as well. But as they're moving out there, they see like the buffalo population as being kind of an obstacle, and so they are there's money to be made from buffalo hide, but there's also money to be made from land if they can acquire it and get the buffalo to move to other areas. And so this is where a lot of the decimation comes in. It's not through disease or anything, it's really through hunting, trying to clear land for more settlement. There is also competition with Native Americans, with American Indians. The competition over land is going to be the subject of the next couple of slides, but when it comes down to the resources, it's some land and water resources, but the buffalo is kind of front and center on this. And when you start looking more so to the American Southwest, you're talking about there being a population of Mexican Americans that are there. Border between the United States and Mexico has been firmly established, but it is not, I mean, there is no physical barrier that's in the way. So you do have Mexican migration crossing the border, and you do have Mexican American citizens that are U.S. citizens that have lived in the American Southwest for a couple of generations. Because remember, the territories that become, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, all those were part of the Mexican cession back in the 1840s. As the competition increases on this, the competition is going to increasingly move to a violent conflict. And like I said, this is the topic of the last two slides that we'll see on this lecture. The last time we talked about the United States American Indian policy, it was Andrew Jackson, it was the 1830s, and it was the Trail of Tears. Since that time, the United States has established treaties with American Indian tribes, kind of like marking where land is going to be, like designating where tribal land is going to be protected on the Great Plains, because in the 1830s and 40s and even into the 1850s, there was no real prospect of what this westward settlement was going to be. Remember, California had been added, but it wasn't until the Compromise of 1850 that you really or the Gold Rush in 1849 that you saw any kind of a population moving out there. And there's really no U.S. population in the Rockies or in the Great Plains, on the way to California. It was just kind of a stopping place. So in 1851, when the United States and several American Indian tribes sign off on the Treaty of Fort Laramie, it really dedicates a large block of land, several blocks of land, that's going to be dedicated for American Indians. So on this map, and you can pause on it and look in a little bit more detail if you want to, but in essence, what you see on these different kind of orange shades, these orange and tan beige shading, the lighter the color, the longer is when it was being protected as Native American land. And so the darker orange is, as you can see, this is like before 1850. So everything that's through here, this is all land that was ceded by American Indians prior to the Treaty of Fort Laramie. Everything in these lighter shades, none of this was really seen as being in question so far as a U.S. interest in settling on those lands. But as settlement in California grew in the 1850s, there are violations that the United States is going to make on this. When there are land disputes in Sand Creek, what's now eastern Colorado, the U.S. Army is called in to kind of protect American settlers that are there, even though this is dedicated land for the Cheyenne and the Apaches. This is dedicated land for them, but the U.S. Army is called in to protect American American settling interests that are there. And in the course of this conflict, there are 25, American Indians that are killed by U.S. Army intervention. Similarly, a little bit further to the north, at the Fetterman Massacre in 1866, it's the same basic story. There's growth of U.S. settlement in that area, and when there are conflicts over the resources that are there, the U.S. Army is called in, and at the Fetterman fight, there are between 75 and 80 American Indians that are killed through this interdiction. This conflict really gets to its peak in 1876 at the Battle of Little Bighorn. And if you're not familiar with that name on this, the other name that this goes by is Custer's Last Stand. By the 1870s, there was really not much thought that there was going to be any interest in the U.S. moving into this part of what is now eastern Montana. But when they start discovering gold resources in the area, more Americans move there. And so this is a spot of conflict over resources. But Battle of Little Bighorn is unique in the sense that this represents a victory for American Indian forces. For whether it is because of tactics and strategy or just the mistakes that George Armstrong Custer made, the result on this is going to be 280 Americans killed on this, and it is one of the only victories that Native Americans will have against the United States Army. And as you might imagine, in the 1870s, any challenge to U.S. authority is going to be met very harshly. And so in response to this resistance and trying to maintain land that on this map is marked as being dedicated land honored by the Treaty of Fort Laramie, the United States is going to meet this resistance with increased military force. And so you see a whole series of what they call the Indian Wars or the Sioux Wars. They kind of stretch from the 1850s and 60s in round one, and from the 1870s and 80s in round two. This is kind of easy, relatively easy for the U.S. Army to intervene in the 1870s because the U.S. Army's already mobilized from the Civil War. You've got a whole lot of soldiers with a whole lot of military time left, and this is seen as an acceptable, justifiable tactic to take. Use of those military resources is to go protect land for the United States. The change on policy that comes after this is reservation policy, where it gets to be more of a tactic from the U.S. government to begin the process of acquiring more land and to dedicating land towards American Indian reservation where they can have some tribal sovereignty there. But this is representing more of a confinement to certain areas of land. And on the map, those are the blue areas. I know you can see the big one over here in Oklahoma. This goes back to the Trail of Tears, but we're talking about this being here in the Dakotas, kind of in the Four Corner States and the Rockies, and really kind of just scattered out. This is going to be a significant turning point in how the United States addresses, Native American lands in general. While the reservation policy and the military action has such a strong negative connotation, even with people at that time period, that the more humane approach that Americans were trying to promote was an idea of Americanization, which is essentially assimilation. Helen Hunt Jackson writes this book in 1881 where she kind of just writes out a whole series of treaties that the United States has signed with various American Indian tribes and proceeds to detail how the United States violated every single one of those treaties. And so the proposed solution that she's got on this is to try to Americanize the American Indian, to try to teach them how to become more mainstream American. Teach them about American economics, the American concept of right, the American concept of property ownership, and in the course of doing this, trying to reduce the amount of bloodshed that occurs on the frontier. So what comes in as part of this is the development of Indian boarding schools. These are schools that are established on reservations that are designed to, well, protect the people, protect the literal human being from from violence and bloodshed. But it's also going to teach them how to read and write English, and how to learn their American history, and how that American history should be really taught the right way, and to kind of be a pro United States version of American history. The way that they kind of phrased this in the 19th century was you kill the Indian but spare the man. You want to remove that, kind of behind the times American Indian culture and modernize them so they can become productive members of this new and growing U.S. society. So the question seems to be for Native American populations, is this going to be a matter of fight until you can no longer fight, or is this going to be an element of assimilate so you can survive but lose your culture in the process of it? By 1887, Congress has passed the Dawes Severalty Act. This is, I mean, they kind of thought about it as being a homestead act for American Indians, where there is a similar provision for 160 acres of free land given to individual families, not tribal ownership, but individual families. And they are allotted 25 years to where they can own the land outright in before, but they just have to like live on and improve land in the meantime. But the reality is, while this is in place, there's a provision where they are allowed to sell this land. And by selling this land, this is going to give, well, a rapid economic benefit at a point in time where they were trying to adapt to an American system. And this is going to create the next wave of this, which is going to be questions about how you're going to preserve American Indian culture and tribal identities. The fact that this is all kind of lumped together and calling them Native Americans, that would be similar to just kind of talking about all Europeans or all Africans as being like one consistent homogenous group of people. It's not an accurate representation of everything. And so those tribal identities are diminishing. And so there are attempts through the Dawes Plan to try to encourage them to develop self-sustaining economic practices, but those self-sustaining practices also include sale of these tribal lands. So if we zoom in on South Dakota here, you can see the protection of reservation land in 1868. And this is basically the western half of the state, but through individual families selling to white settlers that have moved to this part of the country. By 1877, you can start to see the degradation of those tribal lands. And by 1889, you can see that this is getting even smaller. And there is some concern about, like, at what point are these reservation lands going to go completely away? And so as a way to kind of try to preserve this, I mean, the American Indian cultures, the Sioux and the Sioux Nation, which is actually made up of like several different Indian tribes in this area, they developed this process called the ghost dance, which is kind of a harkening back to years past, generations past, where they had more control and more autonomy. And in the course of this, it was seen as, there was a call to the ghosts of the past to help preserve the culture and the onslaught of this growing United States presence that is there. And U.S. citizens in the U.S. Army that is still present in these areas, they see this as a level of a threat on their presence there. So when there is a ghost dance ceremony that is taking place at Wounded Knee here in southern South Dakota, you can see on the map, when this starts here, the U.S. Army is like there in a large presence. And when one shot is fired in the conflict and the standoff that takes place here, the end result is this thing called the massacre or the Battle of Wounded Knee, where there are 300 Native American men and women and children that are killed through the process of this. And this is one of the real, I mean, this is a turning point so far as U.S. as like U.S. Native American relations, because this represents the last time there is any conflict between any Native American tribe and the United States Army. Because at this point, it has been clear that there is no point in continuing any kind of a military conflict, because all that it results with is death and destruction. And so from this point on, conversations that we'll keep having periodically about the presence of Native American populations in the country, the tenor of those conversations change a little bit, because it's not going to be a conflict over existing land. It's going to go more towards a conflict over rights. But that is something that we will pick up again when we get to the 20th century a little bit later on. So on westward expansion, I know this has been a fairly long stretch of video, but when it comes down to westward expansion, there's a lot going on, and it's worth it to pay attention to some of these details as we trace our way through the origins of this, from the Transcontinental Railroad to the ultimate effects economically and so far as policy towards Native Americans.